Boker Tov, everyone. I'm very excited about our topic today. Last week in the Parasha of Yitro, we received the Aseret Hadibrot, what literally means the 10 statements or utterances, often translated to the 10 commandments, which is not entirely correct because there's hundreds of commandments. However, one way to look at it, a helpful way to look at it, is last week these 10 commandments are kind of the building blocks, the foundation for our nation, both our fundamental faith in Hashem, our fundamental idea of Shabbat and the connection with God and creation, and then some very basic laws if you want to have any kind of society. Don't kill and steal. In fact, my daughter has been singing this 10 Commandment song pretty much nonstop, but it's cool. She knows the 10 Commandments really well. And don't ask me how they for a 6-year-old use the one about adultery. Somehow they made it work. But this week's Parsha, I guess the question going into it is, are 10 rules really enough for an entire nation that will last for hundreds and thousands of years? And the answer is no, you need more practical laws. And that's what happens in this Parsha of Mishpatim, the word mishpat meaning a judgment or a certain kind of specific category of law. And we have dozens and dozens and dozens of laws this week, civil laws having to do with buying and selling products, having to do with punishment for attacking someone, but also the ritual laws, because our nation is not just about don't steal and don't kill. We also have a spiritual aspect. So this week is really setting up to actually have a practical nation. You need to have more than just a declaration of your beliefs. You need to have a whole system. But one of the things that even Rashi himself makes explicit is we are not the first people to have a system of laws. Laws have existed long before the Israelites, and in fact, we have access to some of those codes of law. So the question is, were these laws written in a vacuum, or were they written to respond to the reality of the world? And in fact, if one looks at it that way, not to take away the divinity and it having been written by God through the word of Moshe, but that Hashem saw the way the world was running and wanted the Israelites to come in and not start something from total scratch, because that wouldn't have worked. The Israelites wouldn't have known what to do with a system of modern tax law or crossing the street and jaywalking. If that was in the Torah, wouldn't have made sense. They needed a system of law that made sense to people at the time and adjusted and responded to the issues and the challenges of the day. Laws that were really corrupt and backwards. The easiest thing is human sacrifice. Human sacrifice, not a large number, but the idea of sacrificing a child existed. And the Torah knew that and came in and said, we're not getting totally rid of sacrifice, but we are going to change it. No longer human sacrifice, only sacrifice of animals, only certain animals, most of it will be eaten, and only in one of my holy temple or in a sacred site. And what we're going to look at today are two laws that are very deeply troubling to our modern sense of morality. But what I want to look at here is both how the Torah itself is responding to the general idea both of slavery, and when I say vengeance, it's the law of eye for an eye, and then how the rabbis themselves continue to respond to it while respecting the authority of the Torah, but saying, look, we need to adjust this law. It no longer works in our world. We're not going to throw it out because it's a law of God, but we need it to adapt. And that's what I'm going to try and show today, is that Hashem wanted to allow law to evolve for our people and then set up a system giving rabbis and leaders authority to continue to evolve that law when appropriate without ever throwing it out and losing its authority. So before we jump into the very first source, are there any questions just on that hakdama, that introduction? Excellent. So Jane and Ellis, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you first. And the first couple of sources we have are right out of the Torah, starting from this week's parasha. And the first one we're talking about is the language could be slavery or indentured servitude. And one thing that would be another class in and of itself, there is a different set of laws for having a Jewish slave to having a non-Jewish slave. And there are protections for both, but we're focusing specifically on the idea of one's fellow Israelite being a slave. So Jane, if you want to take this first source from this week's Parsha, please.
These are the statutes that you shall place before them. If you purchase a Hebrew slave, then he shall labor for 6 years, but in the 7th he shall go forth to freedom for nothing. If he arrived alone, then he shall go forth alone. But if he had a wife, then his wife shall go forth with him.
Excellent. So there's all other little details about if he has children before he goes into slavery or if he has children while he's in slavery, who do they belong to? And again, there is a different set of laws for a non-Jewish, the Canaanite slave. And again, there are protections that develop for a Canaanite slave. So a Canaanite slave that's being treated well could be a slave forever. If they are abused, then they're allowed to go free. But still, just this very idea of owning another human being, and the idea that if they enter into this slavery, into this servantship with a wife, then they get to go together. But if they marry someone in the master's house, that wife might belong to the master. That's deeply disturbing. So one of the first question that we'll look at, Ellis, I'll give you this one, is why would anyone willingly become a slave and sell themselves into it? Because one of the first important things here is this is not going into a battlefield, putting a knife to someone's throat and saying, come home, you're my slave forever. These are people who willingly enter into this agreement. So one important thing is the slavery that happened in early America was pure, unadulterated evil. And nothing about the Torah would justify it. And in fact, what I would claim, and I think there's a lot of evidence, is that any Jewish Americans or American Jews that owned slaves were breaking Jewish law. The system of slavery in America was against Jewish law. Any kind of slavery is absolutely unacceptable. This one as well, but you can already see here that this is a completely different system than America. So I want to make that very clear distinction. Slavery is bad, stop, but American slavery has zero basis here in the Torah. Certainly the abuse that was given to them. They were actually treated like human beings. Would have been a different story. They weren't. They were treated like animals. So why would a fellow Israelite choose to become a servant or an indentured slave? So please, Ellis.
If your Hebrew brother or sister becomes indigent and serves you for 6 years, then in the 7th year you shall send him forth free from you. When you do send him forth free from you, then you shall not send him forth empty-handed. You shall surely provide him generously from your sheep, from your threshing floor, and from your winepress. That with which God your Lord has blessed you, you shall give it to him. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and God your Lord liberated you. Therefore, I command you this day to do this thing.
Excellent, thank you. Now, my point here is not apologetics and saying, oh, slavery in the Torah wasn't that bad, but you do see here explicit in the text that it is trying to take a system which, again, in those times, there was slavery. I mean, in the Roman Empire, what was it? I don't know, it was like 80%, almost the vast majority of people were what we would call slaves. But the fact that it was just totally widespread, everyone was doing it, which doesn't make it okay. But B, their vision of slavery and the way they treated slaves was different, certainly in the Torah. The Torah had a very high standard here, just in the text without interpretation, for how slaves should be fed, taken care of in their home. But one of the important things that we learned there is why would someone become a slave? And it's because they can't pay off their debts. So what they do is they go to work for a rich person. They give up their freedom, which is the painful thing, the traumatic thing. They give up their freedom for no more than 7 years. And also the Jubilee, the Yovel year, automatically ends all of it and sets everybody, sets all the Israelites free. But basically, they're doing it as a business transaction. I sell myself to you. You have to treat me, as a human being, respect. But ultimately, I do whatever you want, and I'm not a free person until you, the owner, pay off my debt. And that's followed up in this next source as well. And Jane, you can take one more because you had such a short one from Vayikra, Leviticus, please.
If your brother who is with you becomes indigent and is sold to you, then you shall not make him labor as a slave. He shall rather be like an employee and a dweller with you, and he shall serve you no longer than until the Jubilee year. Then he shall go forth from you, he along with his children, to return to his family and to his ancestral estate. For they are my servants that I have taken forth from the land of Egypt, so that they shall not be sold after the manner of slaves. You shall not oppress him harshly, but you shall fear your Lord.
Thank you. Those who were in the class on Tuesday evening about striking in Jewish law, one of the questions is, can someone, even a contracted worker, just quit at any time? And this is one of the source texts for saying yes. The only being that owns us that we can't just walk away from is God, but nobody owns us. And one of the things that I really want to emphasize here is, remember what just happened to us historically. It was in the previous source. They said you were slaves. And it's so clear to me here and to others that the Torah is responding to a legal reality. Slavery was in the world. So the Torah realized, God realized, that just wiping out slavery is not something that the people could process, not something that the Israelites would just do. It was a way of life. It was a business transaction. When you can't pay a debt, you work for 6 years as a slave. And if the Torah said no one shall ever be an eved, a servant like this, the people likely wouldn't have accepted that upon themselves. But to say, we'll continue this process because it can help people get out of debt, what it's really all about, but it needs to be ethical, it needs to be moral. So what the Torah is doing here is, and you can even see this progress as you move from earlier to later in the Torah, as the people are learning the Torah, you can see it building and growing, and Hashem slowly easing us into this idea of this ethical slavery that, as Vayikra says quite explicit, you're not really a slave, you're just an employee. Now you can't quit, but ultimately you're not really a slave. And what we're going to see here is that idea is going to continue in the rabbis. Yes, Isabel, I am going to go ahead and unmute you. Just got to click on your side. And then I'll let you continue reading after you have your question. You just have to click the unmute button on your side as well. Got it. Go ahead, please.
I want to ask a question about this brother who has become indigent.
Yeah. Achicha, they use the word for your brother in Hebrew,
Yeah, okay. Then he shall go forth from you along with his children and return to his family and to his ancestral estate.
Mm-hmm.
So, are we talking about an actual brother, or only a brother because, in fact, he is of the same grouping? What's his ancestral estate?
Sure. So there's two parts here. So when the Torah, unless it's clear that they're talking about actual brothers like Joseph and his brothers, when the Torah talks about brother in this context, it's the same way that Jeremy and I are brothers, or Ellis and I are brothers. As fellow Jews, as Israelites, we are all family. And a lot of the laws that apply just amongst Jews, it's not because we're better than other people. It's because we see ourselves as a real family, the way that my older sister is my sister, and my wife is my wife. So for them, brother doesn't necessarily mean as close as Moses and Aaron, Moshe and Aharon, but it is a family connection. Does that distinction? But when it says ancestral state, the context here is the Yovel. So this Jubilee year is this powerful moment every 50 years. It's the famous, I think it's, what is it, on the Liberty Bell, let freedom ring. And in the Yovel year, it's actually the laws of Shofar and Rosh Hashanah are connected to the laws around the Yovel year. And in it, there's an idea that when the land of Israel was founded, every single family, tribe, person was given their own land. So there's a land for the Dinan family. Now it might be really for the tribe of, Benjamin or the tribe of Issachar, et cetera, like that. But there is a piece of land that ultimately belongs to each person and family based on God. However, people buy and sell land, whether they go in debt and they have to sell their property to be able to afford food and housing for their family. But in the Yovel year, all of that disappears and everybody gets their land back. So in terms of a capitalist economy, the Yovel might be devastating because it breaks all debts and it returns everyone's land to them. Now, we don't do it today because we don't know whose land belongs to who, but when it says ancestral estate, if we could find, there is a land that somehow belongs to my family in Israel. It could be like 10 feet or something like that. No one knows what it is, but in our religion, there is land that belongs to each of our families going back. Even converts would have land that would be given to them and to their Jewish soul, as it were. So the Jubilee year, and again, as I always say, that's a class in and of itself, but it releases all slaves and all land, because ultimately the only one who owns anything is God, and only God can give things. But in the interim, we can buy and sell ourselves, our bodies, as much as we want. Does that answer that question?
Well, I suppose after a fashion, I'm just wondering what they would get back.
Literally their land. If I own 10 acres, I don't really know how big an acreage is. I own 10 acres and I can't afford to feed my children, so I sell it to the Rothschild family. And then the Yovel year comes, it belongs to me. And I don't have to buy it back from the Rothschilds. It's my land and I can do whatever I want with it at this point. Now, after the Yovel year, I guess I could sell it again to the Rothschilds. But it's the land. Now, the question about what if the Rothschilds had built a house there? What about the crops? That's beyond the scope of this conversation, but the ownership of the land and the right to farm it and build on it returns to the original owners, even if they were slaves and now they're freed. Is that clear it up a little more?
Well, we have to go on anyway. Yeah, thank you.
I'm happy to follow up. And again, I think it'd be a fascinating class. What is the Yovel? Why is the Yovel? So since I already have you, Isabel, would you please read? So this is an early Midrash, the Sifra Midrash, on what we're talking about right here, about slaves. So please do not make him.
Do not make him labor as a slave. This means that you shall not make him carry your towel after you or your garments before you to the bathhouse. Do not oppress him harshly. This means that you shall not tell him to heat a cup of water when you
do not need
it, or else to cool a cup when
it is unnecessary.
Do not say to him, dig beneath the grapevines until I return.
Excellent, thank you. So this is in many ways this is actually two different midrashim, a continuation of what was, I believe, in Vayikra, which is that a slave is an employee. Now, that wasn't necessarily written out explicitly in the Torah text, but the rabbis here pick up on the idea of creating a kind of slavery which is ethical and returning the humanity to it. And this is what we'll really see in section B. They take a law from the Torah that might be more expansive, might allow you to get away with more things, perhaps even to beat them if they're not following rules, and it limits what you can do. And it says, yes, they belong to you for 6 years. All the money they make belongs to you because you're paying off their debts, but you can't make them do ridiculous things. You can't just tell them to dig for no reason to teach them a lesson. You can ask them to bring you a cup of coffee when you need a cup of coffee, just like somebody who works in an office. So what the rabbis are doing here is they are shifting this model. And that's again, my emphasis here. God saw a model of slavery which was cruel. And again, as I said, that's kind of slavery still exists today in the 21st century. And America was, or at least the South was built on it. But God saw that slavery long ago and said, that's not how you can treat my human beings. And God shifted it slowly and slowly. Yes, there's slavery, but it's an ethical slavery. And the rabbis took it to the next level and said, we're really not okay with slavery, but the idea of having an indentured servant or an employee who has a long-term contract, but everything you ask them to do needs to be reasonable and appropriate. You can't say, bring me my towel after a bath. And when you see these movies about Roman times and Cleopatra, that's all servants do. Every other scene in these Hollywood movies is someone's taking a bath and a servant is bringing them a towel, and depending on the rating is how much you see. No, you do not make a servant do that. It's basically, I mean, a butler might be a good analogy, but in fact, in movies, butlers do even more than this. Butlers would do anything. So here the rabbis are really limiting what the slave is. And one of the things we'll see is that the rabbis, with respecting the Torah and God's authority, will often limit something so much that it's almost as if it doesn't exist anymore. And it's not a topic of today, but the idea of capital punishment and the cases in which somebody can be put to death for a crime, it's so near impossible. They've essentially said, we respect the law of the Torah, that there is capital punishment, but we're going to make it so difficult that it's as if it doesn't exist. And that's kind of what's happening here. You have somebody who can serve for 6 years, but the way you treat them it's basically like slavery, certainly as we think about it, is gone. So Jeremy, I'm going to unmute you for this last source. And again, we'll see more of how the rabbis are legislating out ideas that they find to be inappropriate or they're uncomfortable with while still respecting God's law. But I think that they're taking the cue from God. God limited laws that existed in the world so that they were not as cruel or as backwards as before. And the rabbis continued that tradition. So please, from the Babylonian Talmud, please.
The sages taught the verse states concerning a Hebrew slave, because he fares well with you, which teaches that the slave should be with you, i.e. treated as your equal in food, meaning that his food must be of the same quality of yours, and with you in drink. That means that there shall not be a situation in which you eat fine bread and he eats inferior bread. Bread from coarse flour mixed with bran, which is low quality. There shall not be a situation in which you drink aged wine and he drinks inferior new wine. There shall not be a situation in which you sleep comfortably on bedding made from soft sheets and he sleeps on straw. From here, the sages stated, anyone who acquires a Hebrew slave is considered like one who acquires a master for himself, because he must be careful that the slave's living conditions are equal to his own.
And I think this is, thank you, that's such a powerful source, because again, the Torah, what it does to the idea of slavery and adding this, treat them with respect, is incredible. But I think it's pretty clear here that the rabbis absolutely take it to the next level. A slave needs to be treated the same as the master. And at this point, and the sad thing is that today there are huge companies that don't treat their paid employees anywhere near as good as their owners. But here the rabbis are saying, if you can't treat your employees equal, then you can't do it. You must treat them. And there's a source, I don't remember exactly where it's from, that talks about having multiple wives, which is technically permitted in Jewish law, even though there was a rabbinic enactment a little over 1,000 years ago to end polygamy for Ashkenazi Jews, so Sephardim go crazy. But the idea is that one can have as many wives as one wants, as long as each one is treated equally. The rabbis say it's hard enough to treat one wife equally, let alone multiple wives. But here again, the rabbis say, fine, slavery, it exists, it's in the Torah, but only in the case where the slave is treated as well, at least as well as the master. And that creates a situation which is either they do it, and then it's basically not slavery, it's better than most employee situations, or a master says it's not worth it. I don't want to have slaves or indentured servants because I can't keep up that quality of living for them. The whole point is I need servants so I can have a nice quality of life and not pay them very much money. And the rabbis say that's not the way it works. If somebody is forced to live in your house and sell themselves to you and do your dirty work, they must be treated equal in all of the niceties they get of life. So again, you see here this funnel narrowing this practice that existed in the world until it basically doesn't exist anymore. And in no way does it reject God and God's law of the Torah. What it does, I think, is really continues that tradition of God taking the way I think God wants the world to be, the way the world is, and how do we get there? Yeah, Jeremy, please.
Yeah, no, I know you mentioned this as well regarding, companies that, are supposed to treat their employees well, but don't always. But one of the things I was thinking about was, most companies nowadays, have specific policies, that people should be treated a certain way, and not be exploited. There shouldn't be any kind of sexual harassment, that kind of stuff. But we all know that unfortunately that stuff still happens. So I'm guessing, at this time period, even though these guidelines are very clear of how people should be treated, that there was probably times that, there's probably a reason that this was needed to be, stated for that reason.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's the whole point. The reality was that when the Torah was given to our people, slavery was, I don't need to claim that. That's the whole point. We had just come out of a slavery where we were deeply abused. And the Torah made clear that is an unacceptable form of slavery. There's an acceptable form of slavery, but the rabbis, again, took that and they funneled it. I think the phrase is even an ukimpta. They just narrowed it down to this very limited possibility. And again, hypothetically, someone could then, not today really, because we're not doing the Yovel for a lot of reasons, we don't have slaves today, but someone hypothetically could have a slave and treat them this way. But again, it's such a rare and near impossible situation. Again, just like capital punishment. Capital punishment is on the books, certainly in a time when we have the temple and the great court, the Sanhedrin, but it's on the books. But to actually enact it is near impossible. And the Torah itself had a very high standard, but the rabbis really picked up on the cues in the oral tradition and recognized that the Torah was moving us towards a more perfect world. Now, there is an internal debate between two of our greatest rabbis, Rambam Maimonides and Ramban Nachmanides, about this idea about the Torah edging us towards perfection. And they really argue about things like sacrifice, where Rambam would say, look, the way that human beings at that time worship gods was with sacrifices. So you couldn't throw it out and say, buy prayer books, buy Sidurim. They wouldn't understand that. So God slowly moved it away from animal sacrifice and slowly narrowed the system. And Ramban said, no, the Torah is perfect. I think both of those things can be true. I think the Torah is perfect, but it also laid down the principles and gave authority to us and our rabbis to keep Torah law, keep observance, but also take the things that are unethical and slowly change the system whereby for all intents and purposes, they wouldn't apply anymore. And what we're going to see is one of the most famous and explicit examples of that happening, where the Torah is pretty darn clear and the rabbis very, very strongly and emphatically say that is absolutely not what it means. It cannot be that. So any questions before we move on to the second section? Beautiful. Rita, are you there? I see your shadow. It looks very James Bond villainy. Okay, very good. So I'm going to unmute you. So this, again, is one of the most famous sections of the Torah, and people usually only know one line of it, ayin tachat ayin, eye for an eye, but it's part of a whole section in our Parsha, again, series of laws. And if you would please take Rita, you just have to click on your side, these verses from Shemot, and it talks about if somebody killed someone, what is the punishment? So please.
But if there is fatality, you should give a life for a life, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, and a hand for a head, and a foot for a foot. A burn for a burn, a wound for a wound, a bruise for a bruise. And if a man strikes the eye of his manservant or the eye of his maidservant and destroys it, he shall set him free in return for his eye. And if he knocks out the tooth of his manservant or the tooth of his maidservant, he shall set him free in return for his tooth.
Excellent. Now, there's two important sections here. The first one is the basic one. If somebody injures someone's eye, then their eye should be injured in return. The second section here is specifically again, come back to slavery, but this applies to Jewish and non-Jewish slaves. So even though the being set free after 7 years and the Yovel and the extremely high quality of care that is meant to be given to an Israelite servant doesn't necessarily apply to a non-Jewish servant. Physically abusing them is not acceptable even for a non-Jewish servant. So while they may not have been treated the same way as a brother, another Jew who is paying off a debt, it is absolutely forbidden to physically injure or beat a non-Jewish slave, even if they're slaves forever. So it's not perfect, but again, it's a little bit better from before, and that's what we'll see in the next source. But here again, if the second section, 26 and 27, again, in the context of the Torah and the way slavery was, good. We accept that. If one injures their servant, Jewish or not Jewish, certainly send them free without question. But the first verses there are, they're disturbing. And even to an audience which is familiar with this, how does this move us forward? If you break my arm, I break your arm. That doesn't seem progressive. But one of the things is to understand, and again, Rashi says this explicitly, that Moshe and God were familiar with all of these systems of laws, and God and Moshe put them together into what became the Torah. And one of the earliest, I actually put this here, is the Torah was probably given sometime around the 1200 years before the Common Era, before the year 0. But there already existed this famous Code of Hammurabi, and around 1754, 1700, about 500 years before the giving of the Torah. And the people both knew of, and in many cases probably followed a lot of these laws. But what we want to look at here is, what's the difference between what Rita just read, verse 26 and 27, and the way that the Code of Hammurabi presents the same cases. So Ellis, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you again. And if you would please take, and it'll go on to the next page, but here in the Code of Hammurabi, there's an A and then there's a B, please.
Okay. If anyone finds runaway male or female slaves in the open country and bring them to their masters, the master of the slaves shall pay him 2 shekels of silver. If anyone is committing a robbery and is caught, then he shall be put to death. If a son strike his father, his hands shall be hewn off.
Just cut
If
right
a man
off, yeah.
knock out the teeth of his equal, his teeth shall be knocked out.
Now that's so important. So some of this stuff is not important, but that line you just read, if a man knock out the teeth of his equal, so if I get in a fight with another a 34-year-old modern Orthodox rabbi, and we break his teeth, and he can break my teeth. But this is where the Code of Hammurabi, a very important line that the Torah is responding to. Or here, one more, and then section B will be it. So go ahead, Ellis, on that last line, if a man.
Yeah. If a man strike a freeborn woman so that she lose her unborn child, he shall pay 10 shekels for her loss.
And by the way, that a similar case is taken up in the Torah, and it becomes a very important part in the conversation actually about abortion. But B here is what we want to focus on. So please, Ellis, B.
Okay. If a man has destroyed the eye of a man of the gentleman class, they shall destroy his eye. If he has destroyed the eye of a commoner, he shall pay 1 mina of silver. If he has destroyed the eye of a gentleman's slave, he shall pay half the slave's price.
So I get in a fight with someone, poke out his eye, and he is the same social class as me, he can poke out my eye. If there's somebody in a higher social class than me, and I poke out his eye, he can poke out my eye. But if I take out the eye of someone who's a lower social class than me, I owe him $5. That's it. That is deeply and painfully unequal, is that rich people are not beholden to the same law. So rich people can go around poking out eyes all they want, and the worst thing they have to do is pay whatever the price is. And it also lowers the status of a slave. If you injure a slave, they're not really people, they're property, they're money. So to rich people, poor people are just property that you can pay for. So when we read the Torah and we see an eye for an eye, and we're, oh, that's so backwards, it's actually not. It's incredibly progressive compared to what the Code of Hammurabi was doing. In the Code of Hammurabi, the eye of 2 people is not equal. What the Torah said is the value of a human being is equal. It doesn't matter if they're rich, doesn't matter if they're a priest or a rabbi or a prophet or the lowliest worker. The value of human life and each part of my body is equal. All human beings are equal in their life. Now, again, we want it to be more progressive and to not say you can poke someone's eye out. To us, that's so backwards. But if we see it in the context of responding to this older Hammurabian system where human beings are not equal, then it makes a lot more sense. And in fact, the idea that if somebody pokes out someone's eye, we don't let them injure the other person, we pay money for it. That actually is a better system for everybody to do. And that actually becomes what happens in the rabbis, is not only is everybody equal, slaves, free men, women, rich people, poor people, presidents, lowly people, we're all equal in the eyes of the law. But the rabbis say we don't actually mean poking out your eye. So again, the Torah makes a clear and explicit shift from the way that human beings were treated in the eyes of the law prior to the giving of the Torah. I'll repeat that again. The way humans were treated in law before the giving of the Torah was very different than what the Torah presents. Equality was something being spread in the Torah to all mankind. And then the rabbis, continuing that tradition, took it to the next step. So Isabel, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. And if you would please take Rashi, and he's quite explicit here about what happens. Do we actually mean poke out someone's eye? So please.
You shall give a life for a life. Our rabbis differ on this matter. Some say that he must actually give up his life, and some say that he must pay money, but not actually a life. And if one intends to kill one person and kills another, He is exempt from the death penalty and must pay his victim's heir his value, as it would be if he were sold in the marketplace.
So there's a lot interesting going on here, because there's this thing called the Goel Dam, the blood redeemer. And the idea is that if somebody kills a member of my family, then I have the right to track them down before they go to trial, or before they go to a refuge city, where they can get, Ali oxen free. And if I kill them, I am not punished because they killed a member of my family. And the point here, as we'll see come out in the next two sources, is that death is the great equalizer. If somebody takes someone's life, then responding by taking their life, even though that's not ideal, and the Torah wants there to be a trial and everything like that, and the rabbis, as Rashi says here, disagree on that and saying it should be money, but death is equal. And everyone dying is death. There's nothing about that. You'll understand why I'm saying that death is equal for all of us. But Isabel, if you take on now eye for an eye, Rashi is quite clear on the rabbinic tradition about what happens if you injured someone's eye, and it would include their tooth, their foot, etc. Please.
An eye for an eye. If a person blinds his neighbor's eye, he must give him the value of his eye, which is how much his price to be sold in the marketplace has decreased without the eye. So is the meaning of all of them, that is, all the injuries enumerated in the following verses, but not the actual amputation of a limb, as our rabbis interpreted it in the chapter entitled
Hachovel.
He who assaults.
Excellent. Literally someone who injures. So when it comes to, and again, you'll understand in the morning why there's a distinction between killing someone. It might be, some say it's okay to kill them back, but taking out an eye, it's not. And to understand that, we look here to Ibn Ezra, and I'll take these last two sources. So Avraham Ibn Ezra, 12th century Spain, talks about eye for an eye, and he goes back to the 10th century. And again, one of the interesting questions is, when the Torah was first given to the Israelites and they're wandering in the wilderness for 40 years, did someone poke out someone's eye and Moses said, poke out his eye back? Or was this something that changed later under the rabbis? And that's not clear. And that's the question of the oral tradition and how it was passed down. But it seems like the idea of not taking eye for an eye literally is a pretty ancient tradition. So again, if somebody pokes out someone's eye and that person says, I was a pilot, I flew planes. Now that you poked out my eye, I can't get that job. I can get another desk job, but you just lost me $40,000 a year. So guess how much money you need to pay me for the next 10 years? You need to pay me $40,000 a year, pretty much until I can get that money back. That's the way that our system understands eye for an eye. And they'll probably make you pay even more for the emotional damage here. So Ibn Ezra explains why we can't take it literally. It says an eye for an eye. Rav Saadia in the 10th century Babylon explained that we cannot explain this verse literally. For if a man struck the eye of his fellow and caused a vision loss equal to 1/3, how will it be possible to inflict precisely the same injury on the perpetrator without either excess nor deficiency? So somebody pokes out my eye and it's injured and I can't see as well, and then I can poke out their eye, but what if I blind them completely? That's not equal. That's not eye for an eye. But if I lose a little bit of my vision and I am a painter, I can say, look, because of you, I'm losing $10,000 a year. I can put a quantity on that. But to give someone the exact same damage, he continues, the wound and the bruise present an even more difficult situation. For if the initial injury was sustained close to a vital organ, perhaps the retaliatory strike will result in the death of the perpetrator. Reason does not tolerate a literal interpretation of this verse. It is impossible to have two equal injuries. And if you say, well, a surgeon could go in and give you the, say, he broke your finger, a surgeon could break in the same way. That's not the point here. Injuries can never be completely equal. And again, it could be based on someone's job. I may not need my hands as much for my job and the other person will. So injuring someone in the same equal fashion is impossible. So even if that might be what the Torah meant, and Hashem's intention was, yes, you can injure someone, but all people are equal in the eyes of Allah. It doesn't matter if you're rich. You don't get out of jail free card. And the rabbi said that clearly Not only are we all equal in the law, but this injuring thing is just code word for the amount of money we pay. And again, if a rich person injures a poor person, it doesn't matter. They still have to pay them the same as if they injured another rich person. The whole point is God set up equality, and he used this coded language that really means that the compensation, the amount you pay back for the damages, should be equal to as if he had taken out your eye, or whatever the fair market price would be. That's not what the Torah says, but it almost doesn't matter. And again, that's my point here, is God clearly in God's Torah intended for us to slowly move and evolve away from these more archaic, less equal systems. And the rabbis with the oral tradition said, we're going to continue the tradition of God and take it. And again, not, lehavdil, not that people have the authority or the wisdom of God, but God gave us authority to be able to develop, adapt, and apply the law. And we did that and said, God wanted the law to move forward, and we're going to move it forward. And we'll use whatever logical means we have. And this last source here is one of the proof texts. We don't need to go into it. It talks about striking someone down and being put to death. And then right after it, it talks about injuring an animal and then payment for it. And they say the fact that those two lines are next to each other, clearly the context here is money. And again, it's very easy to say absolutely not. They just happen to be next to each other. Clearly, death for death, and animals are different because they're animals. But it doesn't matter for the rabbis. The rabbis know what needs to be done, and they find, it's called, there's a phrase for it, an asmachta. They find a verse that backs up what they know needs to happen. And they know that the system of cutting off people's hands for stealing is unacceptable. And if the Torah implies that that's okay, then we need to find some way to read the Torah differently. It is God's law. It is perfect. We're just not reading it right yet. And that's actually a powerful message to us in the 21st century. How do we know that we finally figured out what the Torah means to say to us? And the answer is we haven't. And everyone disagrees. I'm Orthodox, so I believe in a certain system for how the law should develop, and authority and tradition and precedence. But everyone, no matter what they tell you, no matter how Orthodox they are, the Torah, our understanding of the Torah changes, and the law absolutely develops. And it can develop for the better and sometimes for the worse. But again, here, the beautiful thing is that it is clear that God wants the law to be better and to create a better people. And it's clear that we as a people have continued that tradition to this day. And we'll see in 100 years, are there different ways that we'll understand the Torah that will allow us to respond to challenges or challenging things that we still see in the Torah here in the 21st century. But the law is very much still alive and dynamic, and even God showed us that in this week's parasha.